On December 25, 1991, the red flag atop the Kremlin was lowered, signaling the end of a red empire that once cast its shadow over half the globe, and the fire that consumed this great power was ignited by the very war they launched against a Central Asian nation, Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. Look at the screen. This is Afghanistan. Since ancient times, due to its geographical location and natural resources, this land has been a tempting prize for empires. It wasn't until 1919, under the leadership of King Amanullah Khan, that the Afghan people regained independence from British colonial rule, after nearly a century of domination. However, freedom did not mean stability or peace. On the contrary, it ushered in an era of chaos and power struggles in the region. In just 6 decades after expelling the British from their territory, the Afghan throne changed hands 4 times. Things only changed when a military officer named Muhammad Daud Khan staged a coup, overthrowing a monarchy that had lasted over 200 years, and founded the Republic of Afghanistan, becoming its first president. With newfound power in hand, he quickly suppressed a host of political opponents, especially communists, including former allies who had helped him overthrow the monarchy. As a result, on April 27, 1978, the People's Democratic Party almost immediately the new government enacted a series of reform policies, including many progressive measures such as developing Social Security and granting women certain rights they had never had before. One would have expected this to win the support of the majority of the people, but history has shown us the complete opposite. Perhaps the leaders of the PDPA had forgotten one crucial fact. The land they had just seized was home to a population that was over 90% Muslim, with 85% being Sunni and 15% Shia. So, regardless of how progressive their intentions may have been, their reforms clashed directly with the deep-rooted religious traditions of the Afghan people maintained over centuries. It was therefore clear that the people here would never accept the rule of an atheistic communist party. Furthermore, this situation, combined with the PDPA's ongoing repression of anyone with opposing political views, severely damaged its image in the eyes of the Afghan people. What was once seen as a movement that could bring about a new democracy was now viewed as a dictatorship no different from the former regime of President Daud Khan. The breaking point came in March 1979, when 100 Soviet advisors were killed in the city of Herat. In response, the PDPA launched a bombing campaign to suppress the uprising, but instead of eliminating the rebels, they took the lives of over 24,000 innocent civilians. As a result, numerous resistance groups rose up against the government. They became known as the Mujahideen, those who engage in holy war. By the spring of 1979, less than a year after the Saur Revolution, 24 out of Afghanistan's 28 provinces were in open revolt. By December of that year, anti-government forces had seized control of 18 provinces across the country. It was now clear that without external assistance, the collapse of the PDPA regime was only a matter of time. Thus, they turned to their only hope for survival, the big brother of the socialist bloc, the Soviet Union. To the Soviets, thus, on December 5, 1978, Kabul and the Kremlin signed a treaty of friendship, declaring the start of a 20-year era of friendship and cooperation between the two nations. The agreement also affirmed mutual support, both economic and military, should either side request it. It was hoped that this generous aid would help stabilize Afghanistan's political situation, but that hope was short-lived. Barely a year later, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan was on the verge of collapse, forcing Soviet leaders to face two choices: either stand by and watch their ally fall, or enter a war they had never wanted. Eventually, when Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev decided to launch a military intervention into Central Asia, it marked the beginning of what many historians there were also increasing signs that Amin was shifting his policies toward the United States. Therefore, in an effort to ease regional tensions and prevent Afghanistan from aligning with rival powers, especially amid the escalating Cold War, the Kremlin decided it was time for a new leader in the region, someone better and, most importantly, pro-Soviet. On December 27, 1979, Operation Storm 33 was launched to eliminate the head of the Afghan state. Hafizullah Amin and his son were assassinated. At the same time, his political rival, Babrak Karmal, was installed as the new leader of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. It was hoped that eliminating the former president would calm public unrest, but reality turned out quite the opposite. In fact, this move made the image of the Red Army, in the eyes of the Afghan people, even worse. To them, the soldiers from the north had not come. Less than 10 years later, in February 1989, the once mighty Red Army that had defeated Nazi Germany in Europe and crushed Imperial Japan in Asia was forced to retreat, placing itself among the ranks of those defeated in Afghanistan. So we must ask ourselves, why the Soviet Union, the powerful Red Empire that had set the rules for the world through much of the latter half of the 20th century, fell in Afghanistan. From the very start of the war, the Red Army aimed to use its superior military power to crush the Mujahideen, a force considered primitive when compared to one of the most advanced militaries of the time. Despite possessing an arsenal that even the United States feared, the Soviets stuck to outdated strategies that would later become their fatal weakness. They assumed the same tactics that had destroyed fascist powers in the Second World War would be effective in the deserts of Afghanistan. But they forgot a key fact. Afghanistan was not Stalingrad or Berlin. More than 75% of the country's terrain was. It was the rigid application of outdated military doctrines that turned the once feared Red Army, respected across all of Europe, into a force that became all too predictable. This left them constantly caught off guard by the Mujahideen's sudden hit-and-run attacks, unable to react in time. Despite nearly losing control on the ground, the Kremlin still held one trump card: air power. With its combat aircraft squadrons, the Soviet Red Army had almost total dominance over Afghanistan's skies. In fact, during the early years of the war, the local resistance stood virtually no chance against such overwhelming strength. However, that advantage was short-lived because, as history tends to repeat itself, wherever there is the Soviet Union, the United States is never far behind. Washington saw an opportunity to drag its greatest rival into the same kind of quagmire it had once faced in Indochina, and it was determined not to miss the chance. Even before the Soviets officially sent troops into Afghanistan, Washington had already launched Operation Cyclone. Through its ally Pakistan, tons of weapons and supplies were suddenly funneled across the globe into the hands of Islamic fighters, helping them resist both ground and aerial attacks from the Red Army. But things truly began to change in 1986, when shipments of FIM-92 Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile systems arrived from Washington. Moreover, the Soviets barely even tried to justify why they suddenly marched into another sovereign nation. And even if it was to support an ally, the fact that they had taken the life of that country's leader was entirely unacceptable in the eyes of the world. As a result, the Kremlin quickly found itself isolated on the international stage. Even its fellow communist allies condemned the war, especially China, which had long been eager to claim the title of leader of the socialist bloc. Not only that, but the fact that the Soviet Union, a communist and atheist state, invaded a Muslim country sparked fears that a red wave originating from Afghanistan could spill over into the entire region. As a result, waves of volunteer fighters from the Islamic world, via Pakistan, poured into Afghanistan. This transformed the conflict from a simple confrontation between the Afghan people and the Red Army into a holy war for the survival of a religion with over 1 billion followers. It didn't stop there. Even the Soviet people themselves fiercely opposed the war. They found it hard to accept that their sons were being sent thousands of kilometers away to fight in a foreign land with no clear justification. Combined with rampant corruption, this led to a further decline in the Red Army's already low morale. especially when they and their comrades could fall victim to weapons their own commanders had smuggled onto the black market for personal gain. Witnessing all this, in 1985, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev ordered a gradual withdrawal of troops and declared that their military adventure in Central Asia was a bleeding wound. And with mounting instability from both inside and outside, on February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier withdrew from Afghanistan, marking Moscow's defeat. This not only led to the collapse of the PDPA government in Kabul, but also signaled the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union itself, something that perhaps not even seasoned policymakers in Washington could have foreseen. Entering a war without proper preparation, it's not surprising that the Soviet Union was impacted on every front, starting with its economy. To fund its military adventure in Central Asia, the Kremlin spent over $100 billion, a staggering amount for a country already crippled by a bloated and inefficient command economy. Moreover, the war, lacking any justifiable cause, led to international condemnation and isolation. This gave the United States and its allies the perfect pretext to impose a series of sanctions, plunging the already struggling Soviet economy into even deeper crisis. This lit the fuse on a powder keg of unrest that had long existed within the Soviet Union. As the Roman poet Juvenal once wrote, "Give the people bread and circuses and they will never revolt." Yet the Soviet Union did the exact opposite. The need to maintain a steady war budget forced Moscow to slash public spending that should have gone toward the people's welfare. And when life was already precarious, and citizens watched their children being sent off to die in faraway battles, their faith in the Soviet government dwindled with each passing day. Furthermore, the Red Army, once a symbol of national unity and the strength of the regime, suffered a severe loss of credibility during the war, exposing deep internal weaknesses and division within its own ranks. Desertion, drug abuse, and corruption became increasingly rampant, leading the public to lose faith in the once heroic force that had risen to defend the nation during the Great Patriotic War. To make matters worse, amidst all the chaos, the Kremlin welcomed a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who would later be labeled as the traitor who brought down the Red Empire. Upon taking power, Gorbachev used the war in Afghanistan as a lever to push forward his reform agenda, especially regarding political and press freedoms. However, instead of salvaging the situation and gaining support, the horrifying truths about the war, previously covered up, sparked outrage among the public, triggering a massive wave of protests. As the economy and public morale both deteriorated, long-simmering separatist movements in the Soviet republics erupted with newfound intensity. In their eyes, the USSR had become nothing more than a hollow shell of its former glory. Witnessing the humiliating defeat of the Red Army, they realized that Moscow's military no longer had the strength or will to keep them under control as it once did. Consequently, waves of secessionist protests broke out in countries like Ukraine, Latvia, and Georgia, signaling the inevitable collapse of a regime that had once terrified the West. Lasting 9 years, 2 months, and 3 days, with over 15,000 soldiers killed and 40,000 wounded, the Soviet Union's adventure in Afghanistan ended as one of the most devastating military failures of the 20th century. Not only did it fail to achieve its objectives, but it also left the country economically and spiritually drained. Ultimately, on Christmas Day of 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics officially collapsed, ushering in a new era for the world, and leaving behind a costly lesson about military intervention in Afghanistan. Ironically, less than 2 decades later, that very same lesson would be repeated, this time by their greatest rival, the United States.